Lawyers who put together wills, what is the craziest or oddest thing someone wanted to put in theirs? Story 1. My grandfather and his law partner opened a small law firm out of a broom closet in a small Midwestern town in the 50s. Most of their cases were wills and contracts, small town stuff. His very first client was an old farmer who wanted his will made that left, among other things, a taxidermied dog to his only son. By the mid-60s, the firm was rapidly outgrowing their tiny office. A local lawyer passed away suddenly, leaving his office on the town square up for grabs. They took it sight unseen. My granddad and his partner got an awesome lease on a huge law office suite on the town square, 30 yards from the courthouse. The first client guy passed away the very day they got the keys to the new office. His son was the first client at the new office. He came in with a taxidermy dog while they were literally moving boxes. He dealt with his father's estate and planned his own estate, and then he asked my granddad to store the taxidermy dog for a week while he fumigated. My grandfather agreed to put the dog into an unused office, and the guy went on his way. When my granddad moved the dog into an upstairs office, he found a locked wall safe that hadn't been mentioned in the lease. The property owner had no idea it was even there, let alone the combination, and told my granddad he could have whatever he found. My granddad called his best buddies, a couple of young lawyers, doctors, a realtor, and the local mortician, to come help him crack the safe. They tried to crack the safe, even using one of the doctor's stethoscopes, much to their chagrin. They failed miserably. Feeling defeated, they finally called the local locksmith, who managed to get it unlocked. They paid the locksmith before he looked inside, not knowing what sensitive material they might have found. That was a good call. There was no money, but they found a mason jar full of hashish and a couple of quarts of moonshine. It all magically disappeared, and by complete coincidence, the parties they threw were the stuff of small-town legends. The guy came back for the dog a week later, and my grandfather told him that he thought the dog was lucky. The guy redid his will a few years later and left the taxidermy dog to the firm. It was still there when I was a little girl in the 80s. Every time my granddad would bring me to the office, I would pet it the whole time. Story 2. My own grandmother specified which of the children and grandchildren should get which of the family recipes, and somehow felt the need to include commentary about why certain decisions were made. One recipe was this Prohibition-era recipe for beer, which I knew my uncle, also a home brewer, wanted, but she left it to me, with the comment that, "I know you wanted it, Teddy, but she has the second-best penmanship of the girls and will make you a copy." And then, like 8 pages later, in among the specific descriptions of her vast collection of romance novels, really, was a line, "and specific Jude Deveraux title, to Spidey, who will please subtract about half the hops before she copies the beer recipe for her Uncle Teddy so that any of us can drink it." Our John had his IPA last summer and just about died. Uncle John just about burst into tears laughing, and Uncle Teddy had long since left the room because he has no frick whatsoever to give about romance novels. Uncle John, of course, was still in the room because there was also still Yingling. And no, I have no idea how she got this done. My guess is she wrote it herself, and the law students who come to her independent living building signed off on it. It was elaborate, that's for sure. Total value of the estate was well under $8,000, so it was mostly a funny last letter from Grandma. Story 3. I'm not a lawyer, but my dad put something really weird in his will. I was a 17-year-old last year and was the recipient of a rock thrown at my head. I owed it to my dad's quirky sense of humor, and he probably thought it would be the funniest crap to ever happen, and it wasn't even any special rock. It was one you'd find at the bottom of a river. Anyways, this year, I was reading some of the stuff he had written, as I was never allowed to see the will, being that I was too young at the time, and didn't think he'd end up dying. Regardless, the note under my name and recipient items I was to get if he died was, "Throw this rock at X and hit him in the head with it, but make it surprising." And I was thinking, what the crap? Dad, what kind of will is this? Then I read a little further on, and he had left a note saying this is the rock that I had hit him in the head with when he was teaching me how to skip rocks when I was younger, and I hit him so hard, dented his skull above his ear, and it never really healed. It was the most meaningful thing he'd ever done, and after all the years me and my dad had messed around with each other, It was his way of winning and taking the final crack at me. It was so heartfelt, it moved me to tears. He got the last laugh, and I was completely okay with it. Story 4. My grandmother's will had exactly one bequest in it. I was to receive her hunting rifle. Everything else was left to the estate to be divided however my father and uncles saw fit. The will was not found until after the funeral. One of my uncles was going on and on at the visitation about how valuable her rifle is. It's worth so much, blah, blah, blah. It's worth about $700 at the time anyway, probably like $800 now at best. The best part is that almost everyone he talked to about it knew it was supposed to go to me, but no one said a word. Only my father and uncles, with spouses, were at the house cleaning it out, and the uncle that was executor made sure my dad put the rifle in the car right away because he knew it was mine, even without the will, because she talked about it before. When they found the will and showed the wanting uncle, apparently his face spoke volumes. That uncle's wife also wanted my grandmother's necklace and wedding ring, the only 2 items she was buried with. Story 5. When I was about 10, I went to visit my mom's friend with her, as she just found out that her minor sight problems will quickly become full blindness, and so she went to her house to put wind chimes and pretty-sounding things and potent flowers so she could still enjoy her garden, which was her favorite part of her house. The one time I went, my mom had told me that her friend's mom was very sick, but likes to have company, so I went in and talked to her about her pet parrot and just enjoyed time with her. At one point, I told her her bed was very pretty. That was the only time I met that lovely lady. About 4 years later, she passed, and it turns out she rewrote her will after we met and put me in to inherit her bed with the stipulation that they bought me a new mattress as hers was well used. It was the first time I didn't get a hand-me-down mattress. I felt so special. The next time I saw her daughter, she told me that that day made her mom so happy, and she always asked how I was doing. I cried. Story 6. Not a lawyer, yet, but one interesting case in inheritance law that I came across was the one of a super rich owner of a private bank who left his shares to his sons after the condition and restraint that they will act as managers of the private bank, but with a persona, liability concerning the bank's debt. So what he did was give them the money and commit them to lifelong work in the bank, while putting their own assets at risk. So when one of the sons decided to sell his shares because he was old and sick, the courts had to decide whether he gets any money from the will. The condition was not fulfilled anymore as he gave up the manager position. One other son wanted to sell his shares. Of course, that would not have been allowed under the condition either. Owning something with the condition that you can't sell it doesn't really seem like owning it. This rubs me the wrong way. I get that it's the father's money, and he can do whatever he pleases with it, and having those stipulations in his will probably gave him some peace of mind while he was still living, but from the son's perspective, it just becomes a way for the father to continue controlling their lives even after he's gone, if they want to be beholden to the money. To me, it wouldn't be worth it to accept the inheritance if it was attached to a clause like this. Story 7. Not a lawyer, but worked for one and edited any changes he had wanted to make on his wills, as he was older and not very tech-savvy. There was one older woman, about 84 years old, who was, in simplest terms, quite insane, and would call every single month to change her will. It would always be small details, such as removing her daughters because they haven't called her in a while, or increasing one child's percentage and lowering another's, based on whether she was mad at them or not. But one part she would never change was what she would leave for her dog. She wanted to leave her dog $25,000, plus more money for the care of her dog and to make sure she lived comfortably. Sadly, her dog passed away before her, and she had to remove that part from her will. So she just went back to playing with the percentages her daughters would receive. Story 8. My friend's father was insane. Born poor and had polio. Served in World War II and built a business, 10 businesses in various industries, 9 rental homes in 3 states, a bunch of cars and personal property, sent 5 kids and their kids to college, took care of his infirm wife for 11 years without a break or assistance, but he was also a butthole. Refused to tell his kids anything, forbade them from knowing about his condition or visiting him in the hospitals for the 4 years it took him to die. He had transferred all of his assets to a living trust and used a variety of shoddy lawyers to make sure his setup kept running for 2 years after he passed, with his kids blind to it. He took almost a decade to get access, figure out what he had, and unload it. Burned up almost half of what he'd accumulated. No apparent reason aside from stubbornness. Story 9. I'm not a lawyer, currently a law student, but when I used to work as a paralegal in college, I was digitizing paper records for this new estate lawyer who joined our firm in a merger. One will was from 1986, and it included a provision that stipulated which of her 3 sons would be allowed to name one of their children after her. Apparently her name had been in the family for time eternal, and she wanted to make sure the best son was the one who carried it on. It also included a summary of why only one of them, the youngest son, was worthy of the right. It is so specific and honestly pretty freaking cruel to the other 2. It doesn't sound like someone you'd want to name your child after anyway. This one is ironic in that the mother was so concerned about the legacy she was trying to uphold with her name and trying to ensure it lived on with honor, but in fussing about it so much, this very story became her legacy and is probably one of the main things people remember about her now that she's gone. So by fretting so much about how she'd be remembered in future generations, she effectively muddied the image of herself to a point it's not even worth naming a kid after her. Story 10. Guy on the reservation had no family, was big into his Harley, wanted everything to go to the tribe, however. He said he wanted to be buried with the bike in riding position, upside down, under his favorite stretch of road. We spent some time explaining why this was not likely to happen. He was insistent that his buddies already knew the deal and agreed. He just wanted it in writing for the rest of his assets. With a few different clauses, we put it in with the same contingencies. It was interesting, but honestly more of a headache than anything else. I don't expect this to be enforced, but if his riding buddies just do it anyway, at least in spirit, I wouldn't be surprised. Cool dude, awesome tattoos. Story 11. Had a neighbor whose dad passed away, had a couple million coming her way. She was doing well for herself, but not that well. Anyway, her dad put in her will to receive the money she had to first marry her partner. They'd been together for a while, but right before he passed, gay marriage became legal. Then she had to put in an in-ground pool in her backyard, something she always wanted to do, but didn't feel comfortable spending the money needed to do so. Pretty awesome stuff. While she was devastated he was gone, it seemed he wanted to try and make her as happy as possible after he was gone, instead of just giving the money to her. Story 12. One of my cousins discovered something mildly interesting doing genealogical research. In the late 1800s, one of my ancestors was widowed and remarried, and put conditions in his will to care for his second wife. If his son wanted to inherit the farm, he had to permit his stepmother to live there for the rest of her life in a little cottage. She had the right to cook in the kitchen in the main house and plant in a section of the garden. Every year, she was to receive so many bushels of apples, so many bushels of potatoes, and so much firewood cut and stacked at her door. It gives a glimpse of how hard life was in the 1800s if your old age pension consists of firewood and apples. Story 13. My grandmother had her boobs done when she was in her 60s. Nothing really wrong with that, but when she died, she wanted an open casket with her boobs on display. Really, Nana? She passed away at 80 and got exactly what she asked for. Granddad had ended up sticking 2 strategically placed daisies on her boobs, so she got what she wanted, and so did Granddad. Imagine not being warned of this ahead of time. You walk up to the casket and see old ladies' surprisingly perky fun bags on display. Now, this is how you leave a legacy. Simple and effective. Probably helped ease the tension of her funeral by adding a bit of levity to the situation. I've heard of people requesting certain songs be played at their funeral to keep things lighthearted, but this is a whole other level. Story 14. My dad wanted to draft his will to leave his estate to his 3 sisters, as he was sure they would give my sister and I money as we needed it. Not in a trust fund with them as the settlers, but just to them. His lawyer said, "Sans nas, Dad. I'm not going to do that. That's stupid. Your children are going to contest that, and they will win, and the only difference is several $1,000s in court fees and lawyer fees if your sisters contest it, which they probably will. You can leave it to your wife or your children. My sister and I got halves. Good lawyer. Story 15. I wasn't the person who wrote the will because I couldn't yet give legal advice, but I did the client interview and that kind of stuff. The client wanted to leave all her land and stuff to her horse, and so I was like, okay, we can set up an animal trust where the funds will be dedicated to take care of your horse. She argued with me. No, I don't want someone to take care of the horse. I want everything to be left to the horse. So I apologized and wrote down what she wanted and let the attorney deal with that. I wasn't getting paid enough for that crap. Story 16. Lots of people send their friends and family on weird errands to spread their ashes, leaving money for people to take trips and spread their ashes around the world. Pet trusts are a fun one, leaving a whole whack of money in a trust to be used for the care of the pet during their life. However, my favorite ever, that I obviously didn't draft, was a lawyer who left the bulk of his estate, millions in today's dollars, to whatever Toronto area woman had the most children at a specific date some years in the future. I recall the winner had 10. Story 17. My sibling has never been able to keep a job, and my parents provide for her. Makes me nuts. They keep a ledger of all of their expenditures for her living expenses and a proviso which I've seen will split their assets between us 50-50. Then subtract her ledger total from her half, adjust for inflation, and add it to mine. My father also added what he called a poison pill codicil, which states that if anyone disputes the will and loses, they will receive an adjusted amount of only $5. He's a heartless mustard, and I love him. Story 18. Not a lawyer, but military for context. Before I left for Afghanistan, I attempted to get a Viking funeral pyre, as described in Nick Offerman's GQ interview in my will. The JAG, military attorney, laughed so hard he was in tears. Evidently, it's not possible, but he said it's possible to add it to my record of emergency data as a more suggestion. I convinced the wife, before I left, that a funeral pyre or having my ashes shot out of a cannon, like Dr. Hunter S. Thompson, were the only two viable options. She agreed. Story 19. My grandfather left me $1. He had dementia and confused my dad ripping him off with me. He left the rest of the family between $100,000 and a few million each. They all said they felt horrible because they knew the details, but not horrible enough to give up any of their share. The way I see it is, it was never my money to begin with, so it's not a loss. I'm just glad my sister got $100,000. She needed it more than any of the others. Story 20. When my great-granddad passed in his will, he stated that his coin collection be split equally across his family. There were like 8 to 9 of us, and 3 potato sacks full of coins. So we all gathered round a table and each took 1 coin until nothing was left. Among the coins was an iron cross, which was quite odd as the only person on that side of the family that went to war was his dad, and he served with the Anzacs in World War I. Story 21. I advised on a will where the deceased had left considerable assets to people who were passed away when the will was read. Nothing unusual in that, except that they were long passed away when the will was made. The lawyer who made the will seems to have had doubts about his mental state, so sent him to a doctor for tests. The doctor gave him a full bill of health and said he was perfectly composed of mentis. Story 22. When my great-aunt, whom I barely had any relationship with, passed away, I discovered that in her will she left me a taxidermied giant silk moth that she had hanging on her wall. Evidently, someone told her about my love for bugs. I still have it, and it's one of the coolest things in my collection of odd knickknacks. She left my cousin a Furby. She must have really hated your cousin. Story 23. My father is heavily involved in my great-aunt and uncle's lives since their health has begun to decline, both mid-90s with no children, and has seen their will. They have a small fortune, in excess of £1 million, and have left it all to a local dog's home. When he asked them about it, my great-uncle's response was, "Nobody has helped me in life, so I won't be helping anybody either." Story 24. My grandpa, not by blood, had 2 blood daughters who disowned him when I was really young as they'd been brainwashed by their mother. When they found out he was sick, They came snooping around asking about the will, and we wouldn't let them near him. But we let him know. In his will, he left them each $1 with the note, "So you can't say I didn't leave you anything." Story 25. My paternal grandmother left my dad $1 in her will. She always critiqued my parents for being loose with their money, but they were trying to give us kids a good life while living within their means. Times were hard for them, and that was a total slap in the face, in my opinion. My dad just laughed it off and pretended like it didn't bother him, though. He's a real good man. Story 26. Back when I was a JAG officer, I had a soldier request a clause that, if possible, they would like their ashes loaded into a photon torpedo and shot into the sun. I don't think he realized before he went to sign it that his CO was witnessing them all. A friend of mine in the Army requested that if he dies in combat, he'd like his body to be catapulted over one of the post entrance gates where he was stationed. It got approved. Story 27. When a dad died, he set up financial installments so long as his daughter remained under a certain weight. Dude was controlling her diet from the grave. A famous case most law students read is of a mother who left a ton to her son, provided he married a Jewish woman. Well, he was already married to a non-Jewish woman. Big mess. Story 28. My dad had secretly paid off my grandparents' house when he first made some decent money back in the day, but never told the rest of the family. When both grandparents passed, there were a number of surprised faces, realizing that they were not getting a cut of the house. Dad, being dad, sold the house and gave all the grandkids money to go to college. Story 29. Not a lawyer, but my grandmother's will stated that my father had to outlive her by a certain amount of time. I honestly don't remember exactly how long. I was 15. My father passed away less than a month after she did. So instead of things going to my father, the next step was the estate being divided between me, my sister, and 2 cousins. It was so bizarre. Story 30. Not a will, but I was reviewing a client's prenup, and the paperwork stated that in the event of a divorce, they use a coin flip to determine who would keep any joint property. After 30 days, if they didn't decide what they wanted to do, their ex would then be able to have claim over the home and do with it as they wished. Oddest thing I've ever come across. Story 31. My great-aunt, who had no children, put in her will that after a certain percent of her money was distributed evenly amongst her nieces and nephews, the remaining money would go to my dad, provided he used it to throw a big family reunion party. Even after her death, she brought the family together. It was a great party in her honor. Story 32. Lawyer here. Wrote in my own will that I wish to be cremated, and my funeral shall take place 3 miles offshore. My ashes are to be placed in a small wooden boat. Members of my funeral party will then compete for a $10,000 prize for my estate by shooting flaming arrows at my remains. Crossbows are provided. Story 33. My grandfather has in his will to say, "Hi, so-and-so," just so he can say that he mentioned that person in his will. He tells a lot of people in the family that they are in his will. It's a joke that only he thinks is funny, and he won't be around for the punchline. I think it's brilliant. He has about 10 people mentioned. Story 34. My great-grandfather had a pair of socks that he only wore on Christmas Day with the family. They were hideous. After he passed, we found out he left those socks to my uncle in his will and told him to carry on the tradition, which my uncle has done. I've already been told I'm getting them next. Story 35. I work in probate. The oddest thing I've seen in a will is to euthanize their beloved horse, have it cremated, and its ashes scattered with the deceased. Lucky for her horse, she named a horse that was already passed away, so the one she got afterwards lived to see another farm. Story 36. A good clause is always, "for reasons known to them," which is will speak for, "you've gone and messed up, butthole. I don't forgive you." In my own will, I've left my father the contents of my kitchen trash can at the time of my passing, for reasons known to him. Story 37. Worked with a client who wanted language that her cats would be euthanized and buried with her. We had to explain why legally we couldn't do that. The moral part just went over her head. One of the few clients who ever got under my skin. Story 38. Me and a friend from middle school have an agreement that he gets $10 out of my estate. I also want all beneficiaries notified by a mysterious man in a dark suit, preferably on a dark, rainy day. Story 39. My mother left $1 in an envelope for several people with a letter stating why she was leaving these folks only $1 each, but leaving me with everything. It made my mother's funeral pretty interesting. Story 40. I once wrote a will for a guy who thought he could get away with giving his ex-wife half his assets by putting them in a will for his kids. Doesn't work like that, buddy boy. Story 41. My favorite is Ben Franklin leaving money to the cities of Philadelphia and Boston with the requirement that it be invested for at least 200 years. It became millions. Story 42. Lady wanted her small dog to be buried with her. If the dog happened to be alive when the lady passed, she wanted the dog put down and then joined her. Story 43. I researched land and often go through wills to determine ownership of property. To my wife, I leave a length of rope long enough to hang herself. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.